Thank you, Honorable Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to see you all in this auditorium and have an opportunity to speak to you. European integration has always been the choice of Georgian nation, which considers this process as natural return of the country to the European family. Signing of the association agreement, including deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement, is a significant step in this process, which brings it on a qualitatively new level. Association agreement, as announced to be a very ambitious deal, envisages not only increase of bilateral trade and deeper economic integration, but more importantly, this agreement includes political integration and adoption of European standards and practice in Georgia. Moreover, in order to make this process irreversible, association agreement envisages dynamic approximation of Georgian legislation to the EU legislation. We see this process as a chance for Georgia to not only increase its export to EU markets, but also improve business environment in line with EU standards and practice. We already see the very first signs of increased foreign trade flows with European Union. Provisional implementation of DCFTA already affected the structure of Georgia's foreign trade. In particular, based on the preliminary data of 2015, Georgian export to EU market increased by 4% and represent higher than 30% of Georgia's total export. Compared to the previous year, this share increased by 7 percentage points, meaning that EU gradually takes its strong position in Georgian foreign trade. However, there is, of course, still sufficient room for the improvement. Georgian business sector has yet to explore and use the benefits and opportunities that association agreement offers. I would like to reiterate that Georgian government stands ready to work with the private sector in this direction. On the other hand, I believe signing of association agreement, of course, represents a mutual benefit as European companies can have better access to our regional markets through Georgia, keeping in mind that given our bilateral trade policy, our country has free trade agreement with all neighbors. As I already mentioned above, European integration and association agreement in particular dictate the need for creation of strong and competitive private sector where operations will be aligned to European standards and practice. Reform plan of our government serves for that purpose. I would like to briefly touch upon the mentioned plan, including 4 main points. Economic development. First of all, this is tax reform, legislative reform, including administrative reform. Some fundamental changes have already been approved by the government. We are introducing Estonian tax model where only distributed earnings will be taxed, and also some important changes in tax administration where only tax administration will be allowed to inspect companies without involvement of finance police. And the lien on the bank accounts can be put only after court decisions. These are some important changes aligned also with some other changes such as VAT should be imposed only on the assets imported to the country except fixed assets. So this is also a very important change. And another important part of the economic environment reform is introducing startup financing mechanisms, which will allow young, innovative people to get financing without pledging of collateral to the banks. Second important block of the reforms is spatial development, infrastructure, and regional development. We are working very actively on important strategic change of infrastructure projects, which will allow us to double the speed of infrastructure projects, and this will create necessary transit infrastructure in 3-4 years from now. Also, it includes connectivity with important tourism destinations, and for this we are working very closely with international financial institutions. Third block of the reforms is reform of the governance system, which is basically introducing more inclusive governance system and also introducing unified front office for the whole government. This is a fundamental revolutionary reform which will, on one hand, increase the efficiency of the government and, on the other hand, optimize the size of the government. Fourth block of the reform, but maybe the most important, is fundamental educational reform, which is two directions of the educational reform. First is professional education involving private sector and arranging more public-private partnerships for professional education, and also second direction of the educational reform will be fundamental overhaul of the higher education system, which will be based on the demand of the labor market. And government will finance and will spend its financing resources only on those directions which are most needed. I think these are four major reform blocks, but beyond that is capital market reform and pension system reform, which are also two fundamental directions, interrelated, which will bring important changes on one hand, improving the living standards of elderly people, on the other hand, creating long-term local currency investable resources. In the reform process, it is of utmost importance to ensure sufficient involvement of private sector in the decision-making process, as well as in the process of elaboration of respective legislation. Moreover, it is the practice used in European Union and is a part of requirements of the association agreement. Government works on the creation of effective mechanisms in this direction. In order to summarize, I would like to reiterate that Georgian government will implement all necessary reforms and initiatives which, on the one hand, ensures European integration and effective implementation of the association agreement, and on the other hand, supports the improvement of Georgia's business climate and facilitates the activities of existing as well as future businesses. Thank you very much for participating in this event, and I would like to thank Commissioner Sesiliya Mallmström for this very important visit to Georgia. Thank you.
Prime Minister, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you first of all to the EU-Georgia Business Council for organizing this. Thank you for coming. The fact that you are here, so many companies, you are a true living example of the building ties between our economies in the interest of the people of Georgia and of the European Union, of course. And the EU Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, DCFTA as we call it, is part of the association agreement, and it has been, as you know, provisionally applied now for almost 18 months. And the result so far have been very promising. The EU, as Prime Minister said, is a vital and trade and investment partner for Georgia. Almost 1/3 of Georgia's export are to our market, and investments from EU member states account for almost half of the total FDI in Georgia. Since the agreement came into force, Georgian exports to the EU are up by 16%. That is a major achievement, and I think it is only the beginning. Within that figure, there are some inspiring success stories. I think we will hear more about that in a moment. But we have also seen the expansion of more traditional areas like copper and petroleum oils with sizable increases. And there are new success stories. A Georgian company called GeoFlower Limited, collecting wild fruit and flowers from local farmers, process them and then export them to the EU market. We have also seen new export of agricultural products like blueberries and kiwis that can now be found in supermarkets in UK and Germany, etc. And these are new examples showing the potential of this trade agreement for companies like the ones represented here today. And the fact that they are at the EU market is because they meet our food safety, plant health and quality standards. That is not easy, it's a bit cumbersome. We have high standards in the European Union in order to protect our consumers. But this trade agreement is also about helping Georgia to reform its regulatory and business environment in a broad sense. Key principles like boosting competition and strengthening the rule of law, but also putting in place rules to provide the same levels of protection in regulation in many areas, food, of course, but also in others. That is good news for consumers and good news for business, because you are spared the costs of adapting your product once you want to export to the EU. And these success stories show that it is possible for those adaptations to be made, and that the EU is willing to help companies to do so where we can, and of course that there is a potential to do it. In the case of the GeoFlower Limited, EU support helped that company to get international recognized certificates for food safety and quality management, and as a result, the exports increased by 90%, the revenues with 250%, and the number of people they employed by 75%. And this is the kind of results that can happen because, of course, now Georgia and Georgian companies has access to a market of 500 million people. And we hope that there will be more of these examples as we properly implement the agreement, and so far it has gone well. There's also good news here of an overall business climate and the rule of law. Prime Minister outlined some ongoing and planned reforms, and I would like to congratulate the government for all the efforts they have made when it comes to the rule of law and improving the business climate. And that has been recognized by international institutions, the World Bank's Doing Business Index, for instance, where Georgia holds 24th position, ahead of countries like Canada, Switzerland, and Japan. And also the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International, where Georgia ranked 48 among 170 countries. Not at the top, but nevertheless very important progress and a good score. And this is, of course, good for business, but it's also good for the general trust and the consolidation of democracy in the society as a whole. So many things have been done, but there is more to do. The more specific challenges are concerning some food products, and there could be more. Because providing that EU recommendations are met, there is potential for exports of honey in the near future. And in fisheries, where there are few additional steps to be made on a more administrative kind, and hopefully this can create new export opportunities by this time next year. And if we want to generalize these examples, we need to see more progress in the wider sanitary and phytosanitary strategy, covering food quality and safety issues. Beyond food, we know that Georgia chose to implement many of its approximation commitments at a later stage. So some work still remain, even if the government now has chosen to start many of these reforms earlier than planned. In instances like technical barriers to trade, public procurement, there's still work to be done. Focus is also needing, of course, of consolidating the legislative changes to make sure that business voices are heard so that it works in practice. This is not an easy process, so we are happy to help. EU bilateral assistance to Georgia has significantly increased, up to 410 million euros available from 2014 to 2017. And several other factors constrain business growth and development in Georgia. Limited access to finances, especially for startup companies, a deficit of knowledge and technology transfer as part of a wider skill shortage, and the absence of significant government program to support entrepreneurship and innovation. And that is why a DCFTA facility for SMEs have been put in place by the EU. The facility aims to increase the competitiveness of small and medium-sized companies, to ease their access to finance, and to help them to seize new trade opportunities. We are upgrading our efforts to inform the Georgian companies about the opportunities through the use of a common branding name, EU for Business. And under this brand, we want to raise awareness among the business communities and offer also the support to help them benefit from it. Companies will be able to apply for direct financing, for technical assistance, and for business advice. And even with the support of EU, we know, ladies and gentlemen, that reforms are challenging. We have seen that also back home in Europe, and it is difficult here in Georgia, even if there is a very strong commitment as expressed by the Prime Minister. Full implementation of the association agreement and its trade part and the wider reform of the Georgian economy will offer real potential for the future of this country and businesses such as yours. We are definitely ready to help. From the EU side, our representation here, headed by Ambassador Herman, is very engaged, and we will continue from Brussels to do our utmost to help. And we hope that we can count on you as business representatives to support the implementation of the reform process. So thank you for this initiative. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.